The first season of True Detective, an American anthology crime drama created by Nick Pizzolatto, premiered on January 12th of 2014. Season 1 focuses on Louisiana State Police homicide detectives Rustin "Rust" Cole and Martin "Marty" Hart, who investigated a murder of a prostitute, Dora Lang. 17 years later, they must revisit the investigation along with several other unsolved crimes. If you have not seen this first season, I highly recommend it. I grew up and spent the better part of 22 years in Louisiana. The northern and southern parts of the state have only one thing in common. They are both in Louisiana, and the north and south are polar opposites. Northern Louisiana was very Christian religious, almost to the point of fanaticism, and there were also other denominations such as Southern Baptist, Methodist, Church of God, Presbyterian, Assembly of God, Pentecostal, and Church of Christ that existed and still do today. These denominations were very unbending, uncompromising, and would attack any other denomination and those on the left-hand path. The contrast was South Louisiana from New Orleans all the way down the coast to Lake Charles was mostly Catholic and Episcopal religion, a bit more flexible in their approach to their religious beliefs. Those who would attend Sunday Mass would certainly take advantage of all the wonderful indulgent sins offered around New Orleans. The general approach and feeling was that of acceptance no matter what your belief. There also existed a very rich left-hand path culture, and those practices drew many who were searching for either something new or for something that resembled the truth as far as personal belief. It was that search which drew me into hoodoo and ultimately into Satanism. To describe the southern Louisiana social composition, Cajuns are distinct cultural groups of people who have lived mainly in southern Louisiana since the late 18th century. In the past, because of their Akkadian heritage, residential localization, unique language, and Roman Catholicism, it was relatively easy to distinguish Cajuns from other groups in Louisiana. Today, their identity is less clear. It usually applies to those who are descended from Acadians who migrated in the late 1770s and early 1800s from Nova Scotia to what is now Louisiana. The Cajun lifestyle, characterized by rural living, family-centered communities, the Cajun French language, and Roman Catholicism, were and still are attributes of the Cajun community. As with any mass migration, some criminals and undesired individuals made the journey as well. This includes pirates and other outlaws who would seek safe haven up the Mississippi River in the many oxbows and tributaries of southern Louisiana. A person fleeing from the law could absolutely disappear in the vast swamps and wetlands of the bayou. Having social status in Louisiana was no different than anywhere else. There were families who had lived in the outlying parishes since the first explorers made their voyage to the one small trading post called New Orleans. Back in those days, early on, New Orleans and the surrounding areas were known to be havens for criminals, including those who were fleeing prosecution from Europe and Nova Scotia. Some of these were criminal families, and some were two-bit hustlers drawn to this area. In those days, there were very few laws and even less people to enforce those laws. This dynamic invited many people who were either up to no good or who simply were looking for a place to set up their shop for whatever criminal endeavors they may be into. In the 1980s, the internet was not widely available, and so information was not readily available, and there was no way to do a quick Google search to see what the feedback was of certain practitioners. You simply blindly got into a vehicle, went to a meeting, and made a determination for yourself based upon the merit. For so many, this was a one-way trip. Many individuals ended up the centerpiece for what would be a barbaric and truly evil ritual, which ended with them being left in the bayou, food for alligators and creatures of the swamp. For this reason, I constantly say this is the best time of history that we have ever experienced as the human species. We have so much information at our fingertips, yet we are sometimes so stupid. The New Orleans of the 1980s was quite different than the New Orleans of today. There was a very vibrant subculture that existed during the 1980s. Esplanade Boulevard and the French Quarter were pleasant places, and the drug scene and subsequent urban decay had not really taken over. This was a time when the city, like many others, was making a transition from the expensive cocaine, aka the elite nose candy, to that of crack cocaine, a less expensive option, which was much more addictive and debilitating. During this time, there was also a huge influx of heroin, and for me, that would be my drug of choice. During those days, as I began my journey and descent into addiction, I came into direct contact with people who were either involved in the occult or knew of others who were. Some were benevolent practitioners of certain arts like voodoo and hoodoo. There were numerous groups such as Voodoo, the Société Voodoo Gnostique, and Marsh Mafia. Coureur de Mardi Gras always had a certain evil foreboding associated with the groups labeled demonic, antisocial, cult, coven, and incestuous clans, etc. Some were labeled much darker, and there were always rumors of their involvement in maladaptive behavior incorporated into their ritualistic practices. The Marsh Cult, as it was called, consisted of closely knit and very clannish practitioners, and most people knew there were practitioners who conducted human sacrifice. As I began my downhill journey into addiction, I would come into contact with some of these individuals who were supposedly recruiters for the various groups who practiced a radical version of sorcery. Everything from hiring prostitutes as part of their rituals up to and including abductions, abuse, and ultimately murder to support their religious beliefs. Many weary souls were lured into and fell victim to these predatory groups. It was these individuals who would prowl the streets of New Orleans after dark, looking for those unfortunate lost souls who would be part of their future magical workings. I remember the New Orleans bus station being one of those hubs of activities where pimps routinely patrolled looking for new talent to add to their workforce. There were also abductions that took place in the city and in the outlying areas around New Orleans. Some of these were thoroughly investigated and publicized in the local newspapers. However, there were many unfortunate souls who were not part of upper society or whose families were not wealthy enough to draw the attention of the police departments, and they fell through the cracks. I remember one such occurrence as I was getting clean from heroin. After meeting what would be my adopted hoodoo family, a very good friend mentioned there had been another abduction, this time involving a 12-year-old girl whose family was from a town called Belle Chase in Plaquemine Parish. The girl had been walking home from school and had simply disappeared. I can only imagine the torture the parents had to endure as days turned into weeks and weeks turned into months with no closure and no leads in the case. They must have been in the worst pain anyone could ever experience in our three-dimensional world. Sometime later, I heard a rumor about this particular little girl, and the news was not good. It was thought that she had been picked up by a member of a certain sect of practitioners and taken to what was often called a soiree. She was never heard from again. There were always groups involved in certain criminal behavior, and it was thought that this particular night there was a need for blood. I do not know that was in fact her fate for this little girl, but I do know that it is a very plausible explanation for what happened. One thing about these clandestine groups is that they are very careful about who they associate with and what they say and do to ensure that things can never be traced back to them. These groups were composed of a societal spectrum of people, from wealthy elites to those who lived on the wages of petty crime and everyone in between. I wonder how much of the participation in the religious rituals was done in earnest by these powerful men, and how much of it was to cover the kind of abuse that they simply wanted to commit. How many truly believed in and worshipped a deity, and how many simply wanted to abuse others, including children, with impunity. there was always a symbolic Billy Lee Tuttle to satisfy every wicked act of aversion known to man. As the old saying goes, the worst of society sometimes lives on Main Street. One fact remains true. Children are abused and murdered every day around the world. It does not require a coven shouting, "Hail Satan." Our society as a whole does more to harm children than any occult practice could ever do. The similarities between Real Life and True Detective Season 1 blur the lines of reality and the possibilities of such vicious and barbaric happenstances, proving the human to be the most dangerous of the entire animal kingdom. Louisiana has spawned many prolific killers such as Derek Todd Lee, Sean Vincent Gillis, Madame Delphine LaLaurie, Silvestro Silver Dollar Corolla, John Allen Muhammad, Charles Matrenga, and Ronald Dominique. Honorable mention goes to Lee Harvey Oswald, who was born in New Orleans, as well as Stanley Tookie Williams. How could something like ritual abuse and murder take place and be covered up? How could this occur? Let's examine a few real-world examples originating from Louisiana that illustrate how easily this could happen and how many are never brought to justice. In 1911 in Crowley, Louisiana, there was a scene of a horrific murder of an entire family. Officer Ballou, the first to arrive, found Walter Byers, his wife and small son all laying in bed with their skulls split wide open, and the sheets underneath them were drenched in blood. The front door was locked, which indicated the murderer had entered through an open window. In a corner of the room, next to the head of the bed, was a bucket full of blood and a bloodied axe next to it. The bodies of Alexandra and Mimi had been placed by the bedside on their knees as if they were praying, and the woman's arm was draped over the husband's shoulders. The baby and the toddler were in the bed in front of them. On November 27, 1911, the bodies of Norbert Randall, his wife Azima, and their 4 children were found murdered inside their cabin. 8-year-old Albert, 6-year-old Renee, 5-year-old Norbert Jr., and 2-year-old Agnes had been beaten to death with the blunt side of an axe. Norbert had been shot in the head before being bludgeoned. In January 1912, the Broussard family of Lake Charles, Louisiana, Father Felix, his wife, and their 3 children were ambushed by a mad killer. The crime scene was most shocking of all. It not only suggested that Louisiana was the home of a serial murderer, but also a serial murderer who appeared to know a thing or two about the occult. The murdered Broussard children had their blood drained into buckets and left by their beds. A message written in blood, was left on one of the home's walls. It read, "When he maketh the inquisition for blood, he forgetteth not the cry of the humble." The Church of Sacrifice, a cult based in Lafayette, Louisiana, was active in the 1920s. Its leader, Clementine Barnaby, lived in the 500 block of Madison Street in Lafayette. In April of 1912, Clementine confessed to participating in 35 murders in southwest Louisiana and southeast Texas, and at the age of 19, Clementine, the only one ever punished for these homicides, was sent to Angola. The Lafayette killings are thought to have occurred in houses no longer standing near Madison Street and Lafayette Street, near the Southern Pacific Railroad tracks. Clementine is believed to have been born around 1894 in St. Martinville, which is in St. Martin Parish, to Nina Porter and Raymond Barnaby, and she had 3 brothers. Barnaby's father reportedly abused his family. Clementine further claimed that a priestess of the Church of Sacrifice had given her and her friends conjure bags, a good luck charm often found in hoodoo, that would grant them supernatural powers and make them undetectable to authorities. This hoodoo charm spurred Barnaby into committing her first murder to test whether or not the claim of magical protection was true. Between the years of 2005 and 2009, 8 women were killed and their bodies were dumped in drainage canals and along isolated roads near Jennings, Louisiana, in Jefferson Davis Parish. A serial killer was suspected, but questions were raised when investigators realized that most of the victims knew each other very well. Some of the victims had been stabbed or slashed. Others were too badly decomposed to determine a cause of death. A number of these victims were spotted with the same individual just hours before they disappeared. Police misconduct is suspected in this grisly unsolved string of murders. Death in the Bayou, the Jennings 8, a 2019 documentary by Investigation Discovery, dives deep into these crimes and their aftermath. The 8 were Loretta Lewis Chason, who was 28 years old. She was found floating in the river by a fisherman on May 20th, 2005. She was married and had 2 children. June 2005, Ernestine Marie Daniels Patterson, age 30, was found with a throat injury. March 2007, Kristen Gary Lopez, age 21, was allegedly present when a police officer shot and killed a drug dealer in 2005. May 2007, Whitney DuBois, age 26, was found along a road by a passerby. May of 2008, Laconia Muddy Brown, age 23, was found with a throat injury on the side of the road. September 2008, Crystal Shea Benoit Zeno, age 24, who lived with another victim shortly before her death, was found in a wooded area. November 2008, Brittany Gary, age 17, the cousin of Kristen Gary Lopez, was found near a highway. August 2009, Nicole Guillory, age 26, was found near Interstate 10, just hours after she was reported missing. Still, the women had a few things in common. For one, they were all from Jennings. Additionally, some of the women knew each other well. Some had criminal records linked to drugs and sex work. Allegedly, the victims had been used by law enforcement as informants for local drug investigations. Because of these coincidences, speculation has emerged that these women were all killed by a police officer, while others believe the deaths were linked to sex work. With so little evidence available, it is hard to say what happened to these women. The search for justice continues. Satan's Kids Against the Establishment, S.K.A.T.E, was an alleged satanic cult that was active in Louisiana in the early 1990s. Members of the group allegedly referred to themselves as skaters. The skaters were allegedly responsible for the murders of at least one couple in Sulphur, Louisiana. On February 12, 1991, the bodies of Pam and Eric Ellender were discovered in their home. The young daughter was unharmed. The Ellender's car was stolen, and reports were made by eyewitnesses of Chris Prudhomme, who had been seen driving the car along with several passengers. Chris Prudhomme was arrested and confessed to the murders. The problem was Prudhomme's confession did not match what police knew about the case. Chris Prudhomme would later die under mysterious circumstances while in jail. He was found hanged with a suicide note in which he took sole responsibility for the murders. The police believe it was a suicide and have closed the case. Researchers investigating the case are convinced the police are covering up the truth, with the truth being that Chris Prudhomme was a mere patsy for the satanic cult, and Prudhomme was murdered to prevent the cult from being identified. Huey Littleton, father of victim Pam Ellender, would devote his time investigating the murders and their ties to the alleged satanic cult. As a result of his work, more witnesses would come forward with more information on the murders. One witness by the name of Nikki Alderson claims that the cult held a party at the house right after the murder. Alderson claims she was in attendance at the party, but at the time did not know that there were two corpses in the house. Another witness named Chip Richard claimed that he had viewed videotapes of the cult murdering and then sexually assaulting the corpses of both Pam and Eric Ellender. The tapes were allegedly filmed by the cult. Other individuals would be charged in association with the murders. 18-year-old Robert Atkins was charged with stealing the Ellender's car. According to Sean Moody, Atkins confessed to him that the plan was only to rob the Ellenders but Chris Prudhomme found the Ellender's gun in the house and shot and killed them with it. This confession contradicts the testimony of Chip Richard, who claims that Atkins's confession to him was that Chris Prudhomme did not murder anyone, but was merely taking the fall to protect the cult. Robert Atkins, Philip Ledoux, and Kim Manuel were all indicted by a grand jury for the murders. However, to date, not a single one of them has served any time for the murders of Eric and Pam. The police believe the murders were committed by Chris Prudhomme alone, and that with his death the case is closed. The police reject the notion of a satanic cult being responsible for the murders. Huey Littleton continues his quest to find the truth and gain justice for his daughter and son-in-law. Littleton's investigators have found Robert Atkins told a friend that he had been present during the murders. He also claimed that Chris Prudhomme did not murder anyone, but was taking the fall for the cult. Another witness, Pearl Frugy, secretly taped a conversation between herself and her cousin Kim Manuel, who admitted to taking part in the murders. The tape was turned over to the police and Manuel was eventually arrested. A grand jury charged Manuel with 2 counts of second-degree murder, but the charges were dropped later that year. Another witness, Nikki Alderson, a friend of the group, claimed that she went to the party at the house that night after the murders took place. She claims that she did not see the bodies and had no idea that anyone was murdered there until the next day when she saw it on the news. Another witness, Chip Richard, claims that he wasn't present for the murders, but that there was a videotape of the ensuing party. He hinted that Prudhomme may have not even been at the house at all and may have just been the fall guy for the real murderers, Robert Atkins and Philip Ledoux. The sheriff's own son, Richard McElvin, was reported by witnesses to be at the house. Littleton claims this is why investigators wanted the case closed and why the sheriff failed to investigate many of the leads that were presented to him in the investigation. Since the truth about the murders and alleged satanic cult behind it have never been revealed, it is possible that the cult is still active today. The Attorney General's office in Louisiana now considers the case closed, but Huey Littleton will not rest until he has justice for Eric and Pam Ellender. Former Hosanna Church pastor Louis David LaMonica confessed to dedications to Satan inside a Ponchatoula church, though most of the practitioners did not know that the church elders had turned from worshiping Christ to worshiping Satan. 7 church members were indicted in 2005 on charges of molesting children. LaMonica and 7 others were arrested and accused of sexually abusing children and animals at the church as part of ritualistic cult activity that included devil worship, babies dressed in black abused while laying on a pentagram, drinking cat's blood, and placing satanic writings on the church walls. He said there was a pentagram in the middle of the floor and a book of spells and temptations. On this occasion, he claimed that there were 5 others present: Austin Trey Bernard III, then 36, LaMonica's wife Robin, 45, church member Paul Fontenot, 21, Sheriff's Deputy Chris Labatt, 24, and Patricia Trish Peterson, 56. All but Labatt later pleaded guilty to the charges ranging from aggravated rape to sexual battery to obstruction of justice. Labatt was charged with child pornography, but subsequently the charges were dropped. LaMonica described the killing of animals and drinking of blood during ceremonies and ritually raping up to 25 children. Quote, "It was orgies. You put one, meaning child, in the middle, and it was your turn to be with one. Everyone got a turn. It was like no one missed out, including the women." End of quote. He said at least 8 adults participated. After LaMonica's confession, authorities arrested 8 other members of the Hosanna Church congregation, including LaMonica's wife Robin and a Tangipahoa Parish Sheriff's deputy. Police say that the church members abused as many as 24 children, one only a year old, beginning in 1999, in rituals that they say were tied to devil worship. A Tangipahoa Parish jury convicted LaMonica of raping his own 2 sons while both boys were under the age of 11 years old. LaMonica stated, quote, "They would start off like a church service, but it was satanic music. There were candles burning, dark red candle holders, and the dedication of a baby into Satan's service with a pentagram. She was also put into a black dress." End of quote. Trey Bernard's daughter, barely 1 year old at the time, was raped before the group killed a cat and each one drank of its blood. He claimed they did not make the child drink because she was too young and instead took off her dress and sprinkled the blood over her. Explaining why powerful people protect these cults is simple to explain. It's because they are often part of it, and at some point they were actively partaking in either the killings, rapings, or whatever else was done. I'm fairly certain that, since the families involved are sometimes related, the whole thing is a family business. Like how some kids are born into ultra-religious families, and it's the only thing known to these children. Since this is a cult and it involves killings and rape, etc., it is kept a very closely guarded secret. With all of this information about Jeffrey Epstein, I cannot help but think about what Rust Cole was talking about in the series when he said the sprawl of this kind of network. Powerful men doing these heinous acts. No one has a real idea of the scope or the extent of what these people actually do. The small elite who gain wealth in a relatively short time in Uganda is an example of how witch doctors can successfully convince others to commit murder. They claim to have aided many of the rich to gain their wealth. According to the head of the country's anti-human sacrifice task force, child sacrifice is directly linked to rising levels of development and prosperity and an increasing belief that witchcraft can help people get rich quickly. There is more than one creature in the tall grass. A study of the Ugandan context shows great disparity between the rich elite and the average Ugandan who struggles to make ends meet. It is almost impossible for someone born into a poor family to climb up the social ladder and become wealthy. The gap between the rich and the poor, combined with discontent with the political status quo, endemic corruption, and general feeling that the country has lost direction, breeds a lot of discontent and frustration. It is such an environment these witch doctors thrive within, promising desperate people a miracle way to bridge the gap from the have-not to the haves. This illustration happens all over the world in one way or another. I think it is because of individuals like Errol Childress in True Detective, who was part of the family that led the cult. He said that his family had been down in Louisiana for a long time, which implies this was a tradition of child abuse and murder that had been passed down through generations. I also thought following the hurricanes to find victims was very smart, if not outright evil. During chaos, people disappear and are missing. Maybe a body turns up down the line, but maybe not. It even allows for a mistake, since not many people will pay attention to a body that's been soaking in the ditch right after a hurricane in southern Louisiana. Childress is one of the cult's clergymen, so to say. He's been raised from birth to be a Hierophant and the cult's designated executioner. He's tasked to carry out sacrifices, officiating the cult's rituals such as abusing children at the parish schools with Reggie and DeWall, taking part in whatever is happening on the VHS tape that we're exposed to, etc. He is also interpreting the mysteries of He Who Eats Time, which is what their death-themed mysticism is really all about. Childress wasn't the Yellow King. No one in the cult was. The Yellow King was the cosmic Old One they worshipped and sacrificed for. It's understood that the cult did this to ascend to a higher plane of existence and escape the loop, to break free of the notion that time is a flat circle. So much pain and death was delivered by the group. I believe cults like the one represented in True Detective still exist today. They always have and always will, especially when they can operate within a system where they are protected by friends, family, law enforcement, and ultimately get lost under all of the noise that is out in the world today. It's sad, but it is true. Be careful what groups you involve yourself with, and be careful because not everyone has your best interest at heart. If you have enjoyed this, please consider supporting this episode and others of the Exalted series. Without you, it cannot happen. Thank you to my Patreons. Satanic blessings. Hail Satan. Satan, Lucifer, Belial.